They gave me Kethis Station in the 3rd year after my wife died. Not as a gift. Nobody gifts you a posting on an outer shelf decom station. They gave it to me because I put in for a transfer and nobody argued. And because a maintenance technician with 9 years left before pension doesn't generate much friction when he wants to go somewhere quiet. I signed the forms, I packed 2 bags. I took the long hauler out past the Kareth shelf and watched the system's sun shrink to a bright point behind me, and I didn't feel much about any of it. That was the shape of things in those years. I didn't feel much. I worked, I ate, I slept 6 hours and worked some more. People who knew me before would have called it grief. I called it function. There is a difference, and I knew the difference well enough to live inside it. Kethis Station had 42 occupied posts when I arrived, and 9 when I left. Decom is a slow process. The researchers finished their cycles, submitted their final packets, and shipped out 1 cluster at a time, until the only people left were a skeleton facilities team and me. My job was the atrium. The atrium was the station's original core, a wide, high-ceilinged space that the first builders had cut into the rock and then sealed in alloy and composite glass. The outer wall was transparent from floor to vault. You could see the shelf's dust field hanging in the dark beyond it, pale and slow-moving, catching the distant sun in a way that made the whole expanse look like something breathing. I cleaned it twice a week. I logged the environmental readings every morning. I replaced the atmospheric seals on the east vent array 3 times in 9 years. I did my work. And in the center of the atrium, above a basalt dais the original survey crew had never been able to move or explain, hung the crystal. Pale, faceted, about the size of a man's torso. It floated chest-high above the dais, with no visible means of support, no field emitters, no tethers, nothing the station's instruments could ever account for. Dr. Yeneth Karras had published 2 papers on it before she shipped out. Dr. Malin Farst had run 6 months of contact protocols before he gave up, and wrote a very long report recommending reclassification as a naturally occurring phenomenon. The crystal had been logged as Category 3, inert anomaly, for 22 years before I arrived, and it remained Category 3, inert anomaly, for every one of the 9 years I was there. I never tried to touch it. That wasn't my department. I swept the atrium floor around the dais, logged the crystal's position each morning, unchanged, checked that the atmospheric composite around the dais seal was sound, and moved on. Some nights, on the late shift, when the station was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing and the faint structural tick of the outer hull, I would sit on the bench at the atrium's east wall and look at it. I didn't think about it much. I wasn't a thinking about things man, particularly, but I sat there, and the crystal hung pale and still in the light of the dust field coming through the composite glass, and I breathed, and some portion of 9 years passed like that. I thought about Rella sometimes, sitting there. My wife. I thought about the morning I found her, and the weeks afterward, and the particular texture of a grief that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't arrive as a wave or a collapse, but as a new permanent weight you carry the way you carry your own skeleton. Invisibly, always, without ceremony. I thought about how I had kept working through it. Not because I was strong, not because I was anything particular, because stopping had not seemed like something I was permitted to do, and so I hadn't stopped. The crystal had nothing to say about any of this. It hung in the dark and did not move. The decommission order came on a Tuesday. Final shutdown in 30 days. Skeleton crew to reduce to 2 for the handoff inspection. Then the station would be mothballed and locked. My last post. I had 4 months left before pension and no particular plans for them, and I signed the acknowledgement the same way I had signed the transfer request 9 years earlier, without friction, without much feeling, without ceremony. I spent the 30 days doing what I had always done. I swept the atrium, I logged the readings, I replaced the last of the east vent seals, and filed the maintenance report. On the final night, with the other crew members already in their bunks for the early shuttle, I made one last round. I don't know why I stopped in the atrium. Habit, probably. 9 years is a long time to walk a route, and the body remembers its pauses even when the mind doesn't instruct them. I stood in the center of the room with my maintenance log tucked under my arm and looked at the crystal hanging above the dais, pale and unchanged, Category 3, inert anomaly, and I thought, Well, that's that then. I sat down on the east bench. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the dust field shifted its angle against the outer wall, the way it does in the deep part of the station's night cycle, so the light coming through the composite glass went from pale silver to something closer to blue. Long enough that I set the maintenance log down beside me and put my hands in my lap and didn't think about anything at all. That was when it moved. Not dramatically. No flash of light, no sound, no tremor through the station hull. The crystal simply descended. Smoothly, the way a thing moves when it has decided to move, and has no uncertainty about the direction. From chest height above the dais, to my eye level across the room. Then lower. Then it crossed the distance between us, not fast, not slow, and settled into my open hands. It was warm. I had expected cold. Stone is cold. Alien anomalies catalogued for 22 years as inert are cold. Whatever I had expected in the half-second between the crystal moving and the crystal arriving, cold was it. It was warm the way a living thing is warm, the way a hand is warm when someone places it over yours, not radiating heat outward, holding it, and it was lighter than it looked, and heavier than it looked, and both of those things were true at the same time, in a way I did not try to explain. The pale light came up through my palms, not from outside, from inside the stone. From deep in it, rising the way heat rises through old metal, slow and definite. I sat very still. The voice, when it came, was not a sound. It was a pressure. Not in my ears. In my sternum. In the center of my chest. In the bone. As if something was speaking through the structure of me, rather than at me. Words shaped out of that pressure. Clear and unhurried. Carried it clean, first grief. 4 words. 5, counting the title. I counted them twice. I sat in the light with the crystal in my hands, and counted them twice, and said nothing. What I understood did not arrive all at once. It came in the slow way understanding comes, when it is very old news that has simply been waiting for the right moment to be delivered. The builders, whoever they were, whatever civilization had placed this thing on a basalt dais above an outer shelf planet and set it to wait, had not built a lock that opened for strength. They had not built a lock that opened for brilliance, or power, or the right spoken word in the right dead language. They had built a lock that opened for endurance of a particular kind, for grief carried without breaking, for loss held without going hollow. Not because loss is noble, not because suffering earns anything, because the builders had known something about what lasts, about what kind of human architecture persists across 11,000 years of wars and silences, and collapsed civilizations, and long quiet centuries of ordinary people living ordinary lives with ordinary losses. And they had seeded one specific thing in one specific lineage, and then waited for it to find its way back. They had seeded the capacity to carry weight without setting it down. My grandmother had worked the recycling lines on the Oreth Den station for 31 years after her husband died at 42. My father had raised 3 children alone after my mother's accident, and never once told us the work was too much. My wife had died, and I had transferred to the edge of the shelf and swept an atrium for 9 years, and sat in the dark with a piece of alien stone that had nothing to say, and I had not stopped, and I had not gone hollow, and I had not put the weight down. Carried it clean. That was what they had needed. Not a hero. Not an heir in the dramatic sense. The first link in a chain built from the exact shape of human grief that functions, that does not shatter, does not calcify, does not harden into numbness or collapse into silence. The builders had put the key in a lineage, and the lineage had carried it the way I had carried Rella, invisibly, always, without ceremony, for 11,000 years. I don't know how long I sat there. The light from the crystal was steady and pale, and the dust field moved its slow breath against the outer wall, and the station ticked around me in the dark. Eventually, I set the crystal back on the dais. Not because I was told to, because it felt like the right place for it. It rose from my hands as smoothly as it had come, returned to chest height, and hung there. No longer inert, no longer pale, faintly luminous now in a way it had never been before, the light running deep in its facets, like something that had finally decided to stop hiding. I picked up my maintenance log, I walked the rest of my route. I filed the last report. In the morning, I boarded the shuttle with the rest of the skeleton crew, and nobody asked me how the final round had gone, and I didn't volunteer anything. The shuttle pulled away from Kethis Station, and I watched it through the porthole until it was a dark shape against the dust field, and then it was nothing. I don't know what the builders needed the chain for. I don't know what opens next, or where, or when someone else of my lineage will sit in the dark with their hands in their lap and find out the weight they've been carrying was always also a key. That's not my department. My department was the atrium. I kept it.